Chapter 27 of The Curious Quest by Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. For nearly 3 months, Bliss persevered at what had seemed to him at first so impossible a task. Morning and afternoon, with his little black bag, he tramped the streets of Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, and the East End of London, making his daily round. He took his midday meal in all sorts of places and in all sorts of company. His average earnings were about 30 shillings a week, but nearly half of that, notwithstanding her pitiful protests, he had lent to Frances, who, through the return to work of the girl whose place she had taken, was once more out of a situation. His boots were worn through, his clothes were shabby. He was conscious of moments of almost sickening anxiety as he waited with his pencil in his hand, hoping for an order from one of the small manufacturers upon whom he called. Night after night, somewhere about 6 o'clock, he returned to the little factory in Finsbury Place to make his report, and on each occasion, whether he had been fortunate or unfortunate, he was conducted by Mr. Morgan to the nearest public house and regaled to the extent of 1 drink. It was curious how, for the last hour of his labours, he found himself looking forward to the moment when Mr. Morgan would take up his hat from the desk and jerk his thumb towards the door. He was beginning to experience an almost friendly feeling for this large, unwashed man who slaved throughout the day in a cellar, getting twice as much out of his pet machine as any paid operative could, and whom he began to realize was fighting a grim battle against shortness of capital. "We shall pull through, young fellow," he used often to say as they raised their tankards. "You're the best chap I've had at selling heels, and if I could only afford to give a bit of credit, we'd be roping it in. Here's looking at you." One evening, however, Bliss pushed open the door of the office and stood still upon the threshold, dumbfounded. His employer, coatless and collarless as usual, was leaning forward upon his battered deal desk, his head fallen upon his arms. By his side, her hand resting upon his shoulder, was a middle-aged woman, plainly, even shabbily clothed, with a pinched expression about the corners of her lips, which, in these days, Bliss had begun to recognize. He glanced around as he entered. "Hello," Bliss inquired. "Anything wrong?" Mr. Morgan raised his head. His, in its way, was a coarse face, generally covered with the beginnings of a stubbly beard, which were only removed at odd times during the week. He too, however, showed at that moment the common capacity for suffering. His lips were trembling a little, his shoulders had drooped. He seemed to have aged, to have lost something of the coarse vitality which, with him, had meant strength. He looked at Bliss dully for a moment. "This is the young chap who sells the heels," he said to the woman. "You've heard me speak of him. My Mrs. Bliss." Bliss shook hands mechanically. "No bad news, I hope?" "It's a scandalous bit of bad news," the woman replied, patting her husband on the shoulder. "But don't get knocked down by it, Amos. We'll go and see these people together." Bliss removed his hat and set down his bag. "May I know what it's all about?" he inquired. "No harm as I can see, nor any secret about it," Mr. Morgan declared, throwing a piece of paper towards Bliss. "You knew that the big machine wasn't paid for. It's been all I could do lately to pay cash for the leather, though I'm not saying that we're not making a nice little profit on the heels. You see what the engineers say, though. They're going to remove the machine tomorrow. I'm only a fortnight behind, but I paid £40 on the thing, and the brutes collar that." "Can they do it?" Bliss asked incredulously. Mr. Morgan nodded. "They can," he replied. I always knew that there was a risk if I got a bit behind. £97 it is. I'm broke, Bliss. Sorry, as we were getting on so well together. I'm sorry, too, for the old woman's sake," he sighed, patting her hand. "We've had the devil's own luck both over in the States and here, and this time it did seem as though we might have won through. 6 months more at the business I'm doing, and I could have paid for the machine and put another in. There's no one understands this trade as I do, and there's money in it." "Is there any use going to see these people?" Bliss asked. "None," Mr. Morgan answered gloomily. "The manager brought this message round himself." "A beast of a man," the woman declared. "He listened to all Amos and I had to say, and just smiled. The money or the machine tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Never mind, Amos," she went on with an attempt at cheerfulness. "You'll just have to make another start, and that's all there is about it." He looked lifelessly down at the desk. "I'm too old," he muttered. "This time I'm broke and harriet." Bliss experienced a queer sensation which had sometimes stolen into his consciousness during these last few months. Life was no longer a procession of mirrored days. He felt himself breathing a real atmosphere, his feet upon the earth, in intimate touch with the joys and sorrows of live men and women. There was a little lump in his throat, a hot feeling behind his eyes, and suddenly a wave of exquisite pleasure. "Look here," he said. "I've an idea, Mr. Morgan. If you'll just step along with me as usual for a minute, we'll see what can be done." Mr. Morgan shook his head. "I guess beer would choke me tonight." "You come right along," his wife insisted briskly. "And if I'm not in the way, a glass of stout is just what I should like. We'll hear what the young man has to say, Amos." Mr. Morgan rose wearily to his feet. Bliss led the way to their accustomed rendezvous. They sat before a marble-topped table in a sweltering atmosphere, impregnated with the odour of past libations. Bliss himself carried the 3 tankards to the table. "Here's luck," he said. Mr. Morgan replied gloomily. Mrs. Morgan raised her veil and sipped from her tankard. Her red hands were worn with toil. She watched Bliss all the time, anxiously. Perhaps she recognized in his confidence some possible means of salvation. "Look here," Bliss confided. "I know a young fellow. He's a perfect fool, but he's a relative of mine. He won't do a thing for me, never done me anything but harm in my life, but he's the sort of chap who's rather fond of doing other people a good turn, and he's rolling in money. I believe, in fact, I'm pretty well sure," Bliss went on, "that I can get him to lend you this bit." Mr. Morgan sighed. "It don't sound very likely," he declared bluntly. "If you knew a mug of that description, it don't seem to me that you'd be selling heels at 30 bob a week." That's just where you're wrong," Bliss assured him. "You leave this matter to me, and don't worry. You've found me pretty truthful, haven't you?" "I'm not denying it," Mr. Morgan admitted. "Then let me tell you that I wouldn't deceive you in a case like this. You say the money has to be paid by midday tomorrow? Very well. By 11 o'clock, or soon after, you shall have it. You may take my word for it." They were cheered, but not wholly convinced. Bliss, however, fetched them a second tankard from the bar. "Your husband and I," he told Mrs. Morgan, "have had a drink here every night after work, and only one. Tonight it's going to be 2. I can see that neither of you quite believe me, but I'm going to keep my word, so there's no use sitting there looking miserable. By 11 o'clock tomorrow I'm bringing the money." "Then if you do," Mrs. Morgan declared, holding out her hand and struggling to hide the tears in her eyes, "all I can say is, we'll bless you all our lives." At precisely 10 minutes past 11 on the following morning, Bliss pushed open the door of the little office and entered. Mrs. Morgan was standing at the window, watching the street. She turned eagerly towards Bliss. He nodded, smiling. "It's all right," he told her, producing a handful of notes. "I've got it." She rushed to the other door, which led down to the cellar. "Amos," she called out, "Amos, the young man's here. He's got it." Mr. Morgan, fresh from his machine, came up the stairs at a pace which seemed incredible. He wiped his hands upon his apron. His eyes seemed glued on Bliss's face. "It's all right," Bliss assured him. "I've got the money. Sit down and we'll count it." Mr. Morgan's underlip suddenly quivered. "Got it?" he faltered. "You've got the money?" Bliss dangled the roll of notes. "Of course I've got it," he replied. "Didn't I tell you so? Come on, sit down, and I'll hand it over." Mr. Morgan moved toward the desk like a man in a dream. Suddenly he caught his wife's hand. Her arms went round his neck. He turned awkwardly away towards the window, and they stood there together for a moment. "Well, I'm jiggered," he said twice, slowly. Bliss made a great business of lighting a cigarette. When they turned around, he had pulled up his chair to the side of the desk and affected not to notice them. He spoke in his most businesslike manner. "This young fool of a chap," he went on, "was just in the right mood when I tackled him. I explained the difficulty we had in selling our heels because we had to insist upon cash, and he has made a proposition which I hope you will agree to. Here's the £100 to pay for the machine outright. Bank of England notes, you see. And what this young ass proposes is that he should advance you £500. I've got the notes here. On your note of hand, interest to be paid at 5% per annum. Is that agreeable to you, Mr. Morgan?" "Is that what?" Mr. Morgan faltered unsteadily. "Agreeable. Will you accept the money on those terms?" Bliss asked. Mr. Morgan made no further pretence of concealing his emotion. He leaned his head upon his arms and sobbed. His wife sat by his side and patted his shoulder. "Don't take any notice of him for a moment, Mr. Bliss," she said. "We've had a real hard time, he and I, always struggling a little way up and always being beaten back. There was never such a worker as Amos either. Nothing seemed to discourage him. I've seen him face ruin half a dozen times through no fault of his own, and not take on like this. But it'll do him good. 17 years we've had, and never more than £2 or £3 a week to draw, and bad luck coming along just as things got going every time, and I expect this is a bit too much for him. But it's there. The money's there, isn't it, young man? You're not taking it away again?" Bliss stuffed the notes carefully into Mr. Morgan's pocket. "All you've got to do is sign this," he said, "and then we've never done it in the morning before, but I think we might drop round the corner for one moment. Mr. Morgan's a bit upset, and I have had a busy morning myself." Mr. Morgan lifted his head. He was himself again, rejuvenated, buoyant. He read through the few lines which Bliss had written and signed them joyfully. Then he transferred the notes to the inside pocket of his coat and buttoned it up. He held out both his hands to Bliss. "Young fellow," he declared with a beaming face, "it was the luckiest day of my life when I boarded that tram car from Camberwell. You've been the best thing that's happened into the lives of two people who've worked hard and done their best to live honest. That's all I can say. It ain't much. I'm a worker, not a talker. Mother, take his other arm and we'll go and have that drink." They marched down the stairs and into the street, Bliss between the two of them. It was an ugly neighbourhood. The day was sulphurously hot. The smell of the public house was more poignant than ever. Mrs. Morgan's arm was linked through his on one side. His employer was gripping him tightly on the other. Mrs. Morgan's bonnet was very much awry. One string was hanging down, and she'd forgotten her gloves. They both held on to Bliss as though he were a lifelong friend. There was not a single redeeming element in the situation, yet Bliss walked with his head thrown back, his heart beating with pleasure. The memory of those weary months of toil and privation seemed to have fallen away from him. It was one more real draught of the elixir of life. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Curious Quest by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. By Jove, if it isn't Ernest Bliss. Bliss, who was crossing the Strand on his way to the nearest Labour Bureau, glanced up quickly. The thing which he had dreaded so long had happened at last. He recognised the speaker with a sinking heart. Dick Honiton. A very smart young man about town, one of his quondam companions, a man whom everyone seemed to know, and no one knew anything about. He was dressed as usual in the height of fashion, and although he grasped Bliss heartily by the hand, it was obvious that he was struggling with an immense astonishment. "My dear fellow," he exclaimed, "why, do you know that you're one of the mysteries of London? Where have you been to? What's happened? What's the meaning of it all?" "I didn't know there was any mystery about it," Bliss replied evasively. "I thought that everyone had heard of my misfortunes." The young man coughed. He had too much tact, however, to be at a complete loss. "So it's true, is it, that you've lost all your tin, old chap?" he remarked compassionately. "No reason why you should slip away and hide, though. I'm quite certain that some of your old pals would like to have a chance of doing something for you." "Very kind, I'm sure," Bliss muttered. "All the same, I've a feeling that now I have to earn my own living, I'd rather do it amongst a different class of people." "It's really as bad as that, is it?" Honiton observed, with polite regret. Bliss assented gloomily. Since the day when, in accordance with the terms of his unwritten wager, he had been obliged, to their joint and profound regret, to sever his connection with Mr. Amos Morgan, he had spent the last fortnight applying for situations an hour too late, missing others because of some trifling disqualification. He was left at that moment with less than a shilling in his pocket and the rent of his room due on the following day. His clothes, too, had suffered. He had torn his coat, and Mrs. Heath's attempts at repairing it were distinctly amateurish. There was a hole in the sole of his boot, mercifully concealed, but of which he was none the less acutely conscious. The bottoms of his trousers were frayed. The nap had worn off his clothes through too frequent brushings. The hand of poverty had him now closely in its grip. His face was a little pinched. For 2 mornings he had been obliged to deny himself the luxury of a shave. Worst of all, he had dared not go near Francis for more than a week. Not all his optimism could have explained away his almost painful condition, and the one thing he dreaded more than anything else in life was that she should lose that little flame of hope which he had striven so desperately to keep alight. So long as they did not meet, he was safe. He had her promise that she would do nothing without giving him warning, so he contented himself with sending her cheerful little notes and explaining that he was too busy for a few days to snatch even an hour from his work. "As bad as it can be," he sighed. "I've had a job as a chauffeur. I'm looking for another one now." Dick Honiton was a young man who lived by his wits, an astute person who prided himself that he had no heart and little conscience. He immediately proceeded, however, to belie himself. "Come and have a drink, old fellow," he invited. Bliss looked down at his clothes. They were as neat as they could be made, but they became his present situation in life. He was painfully conscious again of that hole in the sole of his boot. Honiton thrust an understanding arm through his. "Don't be a fool," he said. "We'll go across to Ransom's. You won't see a soul there, you know, and if you'll forgive my saying so, you look as if a stiff whisky and soda would do you good." "A very stiff one," Bliss admitted. "With a dry biscuit would do me a great deal of good." They entered a popular bar in the locality and seated themselves before a round table. Honiton at once ordered the drinks. "You know," he declared, "this really takes the wind out of my sails, Bliss. Why, it's only 6 or 8 months ago that I asked you to lend me £1,000. "I know," Bliss replied, "and I very nearly did it." "As it wouldn't have made any difference to you after all," Honiton sighed. "I must say that I wish you had. I was rather tired of doing nothing, and it would have given me a chance to buy a share in a wine merchant's business. However, it's no good worrying about that. The boot's on the other leg now, and we must see if we can't do something for you. I haven't much oomph, as you know, but I fancy that I have brains, and I've helped 1 or 2 fellows out of a hole. We must see about a job for you at once." "I say, that's very kind of you," Bliss murmured. "Chuck it," Honiton went on. "I'm not very flush, as I said, but you've stood me a good many dinners and other pleasant times in your life, and thank heaven I can still spare a fiver for a pal and never feel it," he added, his hand stealing toward his breast pocket. "So if you'll just say the word—" Bliss stretched out his hand and stopped him. Once more he was conscious of a strange new sensation, a queer warm feeling at his heart, a sense of a real friendship with others in the world who in the old days had seemed like puppets. Dick Honiton, too, for whom so few people had a good word. What an amazing world it was, after all. "It's awfully kind of you, Honiton, old chap," he said. "I know your address, and if I come really dead up against it, I'll remind you of this. But I'm not quite on my uppers yet, and I'm bound to get a job in a few days." Honiton withdrew his hand a little reluctantly, but not without some indications of relief. "Well, then," he continued, "we must see what we can do about that job. Seems to me that you're not looking at this matter in the proper light, Bliss. There are heaps of ways a fellow who has crowds of pals like you had could make a bit without taking to menial work." "I don't call driving a car menial work," Bliss objected. Honiton shrugged his shoulders. "Well," he remarked doubtfully, "that's how you like to look at it." "It's honest work," Bliss persisted, "and I used to drive a car often enough for pleasure. Why shouldn't I do it for a salary, now that I've got to earn my living some way or other?" Mr. Honiton flicked a speck of dust from his patent shoes. "Well, one thing against it," he pointed out, "is that you've got to have a master. Can't be very pleasant for you. Now, I don't see why you can't pick up a bit and keep independent. There's a chap I know in the city. He's a Jew, but an awfully good sort, who buys cigarettes and wine and cigars. He won't touch anything that isn't good stuff, and he gets them cheap. He's always willing to allow a big commission to anyone who has a clientele and can sell them for him. Those large cabanas I sold you, Bliss, 200 bob a box you gave for them, and real toppers they were, came from him. You see, I'm not ashamed of earning a bit for myself that way, if I can." "It's awfully kind of you," Bliss said hesitatingly. "I'm not sure, though, whether I should care to show myself amongst my old pals." "Oh, that's all bally nonsense," Mr. Honiton declared. "If you won't have the loan I spoke of, I'll see to rigging you out, What's the good of having had friends and having done them all jolly well when you had them ready, if you don't make a bit of use of them now you're up a tree? Bliss shook his head. I'd rather emigrate. Honiton passed his cigarette case to his companion, lit one himself, and slipped the remainder of its contents into the former's pockets. "I'd like your opinion of those," he explained hurriedly. "You can't tell what they're like from one. Now, here's another idea. If you don't fancy you've got the gift for selling, what about keeping your eyes open for some of these young fellows about town with more oomph than they can do with, and bringing them into little Jacob's for a quiet flutter now and then? Chamois, you know, on the QT. It's worth a £5 or even a tenner any night. So if you can get hold of the right sort, and Jacob's will initial your restaurant bills at 2 or 3 places in town." Bliss shook his head more firmly than ever. "I couldn't do it," he insisted frankly. "Don't you bother about me, Honiton. I'll have to muddle through on my own." Honiton finished his drink and sighed. "Well," he observed, "you don't seem an easy chap to help." "I am not," Bliss confessed. "Never mind. If I really get on the beach, I shall drop you a line. It's done me good to have met you this morning, and to have known that you weren't ashamed to stand me a drink, and you may be sure that I shall enjoy the cigarettes. By the by, I suppose you've missed your chance at that partnership." "It's still open," Honiton replied, a little wistfully. "But there's no chance of my touching the oomph. So long, Bliss. You're a queer fish, but the £5 will be there for you any time you like to send for it." "I shan't forget," Bliss assured him heartily. Bliss made his way down the Strand to Charing Cross Station and entered a telephone box. He parted with the twopence with a sigh and rang up his lawyer. In a few minutes Mr. Crawley himself came to the telephone. "Is that you, Crawley?" "That's Mr. Bliss's voice," the lawyer exclaimed excitedly. "For heaven's sake!" "Dry up," Bliss interrupted. "Just listen to me for a moment. I've got some instructions for you. There's a man named Honiton, Dick Honiton, rooms 110 Jermyn Street. You're to write him a line today and say that a client who desires to be nameless is prepared to advance him £1,000 for 5 years, free of interest, if he can use the money profitably. You understand?" "Certainly, Mr. Bliss. We'll attend to the matter this morning. And now, with regard to—" "Goodbye," Bliss said pleasantly, and rang off. The Labour Bureau seemed more hopeless than usual. Inquiries at the more august establishment where Bliss had paid his half-guinea were fruitless. He went back to his lodgings, tired out, and for the first time omitted to pay Mrs. Heath her weekly bill. He threw himself upon the bed for a few hours, and then, some time before dawn, rose again and made his way to Covent Garden. He was stiff and tired and a little sick. Nevertheless, he made his way doggedly enough amongst the market carts, looking out always for a job at loading or unloading. At last it seemed to him that his chance had come. A dray, piled up with flowers and vegetables, was just about to start when the driver, who had been sitting for some minutes with the reins in his hands, beckoned to him. "Want a job as an unloader?" he inquired. "I'm out Balham and Streatham way. It's worth £half-a-crown." "I am on," Bliss replied readily. "Shall I climb up behind?" The former was on the point of assenting when 2 unsavoury-looking men emerged from a public house a few yards away. One of them, red-faced, truculent, the very type of the loafing bully, shook his fist at the driver. "Now you," he shouted, "chuck that. My pal Tim's coming along with you." "All very well," the carter grumbled, "but I've just engaged another chap. I've waited for your friend Tim long enough." "My friend Tim," the other replied, "is going to have that job, or I'll make mincemeat out of you both." The driver pointed with his whip to the broken-down, bleary-eyed loafer who was standing on one side with his hands in his pockets, listening to the conversation. Is that your pal? He asked. It is, the red-faced man assented. And if anyone's anything to say against him, they better not say it in my presence, that's all. Up you gets on the wagon, Tim. I beg your pardon, Bliss intervened. I'm engaged for this job. The red-faced man, his mouth open with a surprise which amounted to stupefaction, turned around. It took him a moment or two to grasp the situation. As soon as he did, however, he pulled off his coat with an angry roar and threw it towards his friend. Now then, he wound up after a stream of lurid abuse, will you hook it, or will you take a hiding? I don't want to fight, Bliss replied, but this is my job, and unless I'm told to go by the man who engaged me, I shall stick to it. The greengrocer maintained a discreet silence. The red-faced man came on. He aimed a blow at Bliss which would have killed him if the latter had not ducked. Then he overbalanced himself, recovered, and fetched Bliss a blow on the chest which nearly carried him off his feet. Bliss, who had very little idea of how to use his fists, struck out blindly, and by chance caught the other man on the cheek. The greengrocer looked around. Steady, young'un, he counselled. That's Butcher Bill you're up against. He'll kill you if you don't mind. Perhaps you'd better sheer off. I shan't, Bliss declared doggedly. You offered me the job, and I want it. It's only £50, the driver reminded him, and you'll get your head broken, and mine too, perhaps. Who's going to break it? Bliss asked. Well, I will show you, the man called Butcher Bill roared. He advanced more cautiously this time, but with all manner of evil things shining out of his bleary eyes. Bliss clenched his teeth and his fists. A sudden blind rage had seized him. The job was his. No one had any right to interfere, more especially on behalf of such a loafing vagabond. By good luck he escaped his opponent's onslaught. By good luck again, although he struck his assailant but a feeble blow, the latter slipped on a piece of orange peel and fell into the gutter. Bliss, whose head was reeling, sprang at once onto the back of the cart. Drive off, he begged the man. It'll take him a minute to get up. They drove off, and, for various reasons, Butcher Bill declined to leave his resting place. Bliss worked unloading vegetables at different fruiterers' shops until he was almost dead with fatigue. When the wagon was empty, it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was out at Streatham. Drive you back if you like, the carter suggested. Bliss nodded and threw himself down on the dray with his head on a pile of empty sacks. He slept till they reached once more the neighbourhood of Covent Garden. You look about done, the carter remarked, as they pulled up outside a public house. I'll stand you a pint. Bliss, following his companion inside, was suddenly giddy. There was some hot coffee being served, which he drank almost feverishly. Soon his blood began to circulate once more. He bade his friend good morning. Give you a job any time I drop acres on you, the latter promised, as he handed him the £50. If you'll take my advice, you'll keep nut of Bill Butcher's way, though. He was 3 parts drunk this morning, but he can use his fists above a bit, and he's a fair brute. He'd kill a man as soon as look at him. I haven't seen anyone stand up to him for Lord knows how long, and you'd have been done in all right if you hadn't been a bit dodgy on your feet. Bliss started wearily back towards his lodgings. A grey mist had fallen like a shroud upon the London streets, a mist which was turning all the time to moisture, wetting his clothes, chilling the life out of him. He walked slowly and with heavy footsteps. He took no interest in the passers-by. Yet, as he crossed one gloomy square, the houses of which seemed to frown down upon him like barracks, he was conscious of a girl who appeared suddenly upon the pavement only a few yards before him. She glanced back at the house from which she had issued, and her expression suddenly aroused his interest. She was terrified. She had the look of one who had escaped from prison, and who was yet in dire fear of recapture. Then she turned her head toward Bliss and approached him swiftly. Her eyes shone with eager hope. She accosted him even when he was a few yards away. "I don't know who you are," she exclaimed, "but help me, please. I have escaped from that house. Don't ask me anything about it. Give me the money for a taxicab, quickly. I must get away." She hailed a passing cab, and as it drew up at the curbstone, she looked once more appealingly at Bliss, her hand outstretched, her white face still tremulous with terror. Bliss felt the half-crown in his waistcoat pocket. "You will never regret it in all your life," she continued quickly. "Tell me your name. Tell me when to send it to. Just half-a-crown, no more. Oh, quickly, quickly, please, someone will come out." Bliss's fingers were slowly withdrawn from his waistcoat pocket. She snatched at the half-crown and jumped into the taxicab. The vehicle vanished in the mist. Bliss stood for a moment looking after it. Then he looked up at the house, frowning. Almost as he did so, the front door was opened. A man in a light tweed suit, with a bunch of violets in his buttonhole, came out, humming a tune. He looked up and down the street. When he saw Bliss, he too approached him. "Excuse me," he said pleasantly. "Have you seen a young lady?" "I have," Bliss admitted. "Can you tell me which way she has gone?" "I can tell you nothing about her," Bliss replied grimly. The man stared at him for a moment. His face suddenly lost its good-humoured expression. "I say," he exclaimed, "you don't mean to tell me you've given her half-a-crown?" Bliss was startled. The mention of the precise sum puzzled him. "If you want to know," he said slowly, "I have lent the lady half-a-crown to get away from the house which you have just left, and from what she told me, I am half inclined to go in and make some inquiries." The man took the cigarette from his mouth, leaned against the railings, and laughed until the tears came into his eyes. Bliss looked at him in astonishment. "I've lost," he remarked resignedly. "Have you many half-crowns, young man, that you can throw away so easily?" "I have very few indeed," Bliss replied. "But I suppose she told you that she'd been insulted in that house and was trying to escape from someone, eh?" "Well, she certainly left that impression," Bliss acknowledged, with a sudden sinking of the heart. The man had ceased to laugh. He was looking now a little annoyed. "Well, you've cost me a fiver and put me in a very awkward position," he declared. "That little girl's an actress. Lives in that boarding-house. She's been bothering me to get her a job for the last 2 months. I told her last night that she couldn't act. She bet me a £5 note that she could run out of the house, borrow half-a-crown from the first perfect stranger she met, and get away with it. I was fool enough to take the bet. Now I've lost, and I shall have to find her a job too, confound you, sir." "If your story is a true one," Bliss said, "perhaps, as you know the young lady, you wouldn't mind returning my half-crown. I've been working all night for it." "I'll see you hanged first," the other replied irritably. "You've cost me a fiver as it is. If you can't take better care of your money, you don't deserve to have any. Any person of reasonable intelligence ought to have been able to see that the whole affair was only a joke." "A joke," Bliss repeated blankly, his voice trembling a little. The theatrical gentleman, however, had walked off swinging his cane. Bliss looked after him for a moment wistfully. Then he turned up his coat collar and plunged into the mist, which was fast changing into rain. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Curious Quest by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Bliss awoke shivering on the following morning after a night of fatigued and spasmodic slumber, and having performed his ablutions with the maximum of discomfort, sat down to await the arrival of his frugal breakfast. It was a fortnight since he had earned more than an odd shilling or two, and the 51 days which still remained before the anniversary of his visit to the physician seemed like an unbridgeable chasm of time. His limbs ached, his head felt hot. The thought of the forthcoming weak tea and thick bread and butter was more than usually distasteful. Amongst his dreary surroundings he sat for a moment or two and dreamed of his empty flat in Alton Court. The soft, luxurious warmth of it, the thick carpets, the diligent care of a trained manservant. He even fancied that he could smell his coffee. He thought of the crisp hot rolls, the yellow butter, and the dish of marmalade. 51 days more. It was for Frances as well as himself that he suffered now. He had not ventured to go near her, and his task of writing those cheerful little notes had become day by day more difficult. He set his teeth and clenched his fists. Every impulse in his body seemed drawing him towards the door, down the bare stairway, into the street, to throw himself into a taxicab, to go and call for Frances and take her back with him into the life from which his own whim had exiled him, to confess himself beaten, for her sake as well as his own. Then he heard the sound of his own name, and unconsciously he listened. It was his neighbour in the next room, the wife of a foreman printer, talking to his landlady. "If you can't let me have the other room, Mrs. Heath, you must take a week's notice. So there. What with baby and the other children, I haven't a yard to turn around in, and Jim said to me only this morning he was willing to pay for it, and if we couldn't get what we wanted here, we must move. That young fellow Bliss, or whatever his name is, can get a room somewhere else all right. You better tell him how things are." He heard his landlady's reply. Her quiet, tired voice came to him with a new significance. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mappin," she said, "if you'd let it be just for a week or so. The young fellow's been out of work, and he's owing me a bit. I don't like to turn him out onto the streets. He's been brought up different, anyone can see that. And my husband used to say that the young man who has once had to sleep out without a roof over his head was never quite the same afterwards." "I don't care what your husband used to say, my good woman," was the shrill reply. "If I can't have that room, we leave on Saturday." Mrs. Heath's reply was inaudible. Bliss rose to his feet. Immediately afterwards she entered with the breakfast tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Heath," he said tentatively. "Good morning," she replied, with her usual attempt at cheerfulness. "Your breakfast, sir?" She turned towards the door a little wearily. In her face the signs of her lifelong struggle were more than usually visible. "Anything to say to me, Mrs. Heath?" Bliss asked. She shook her head. "Maybe you heard," she replied. "No, I've nothing to say." "They're good tenants, aren't they?" "The best I've got." "I'll pay you what I owe you this morning," Bliss promised, "and you better let them have my room. I can easily find shelter somewhere else." "I'm not asking you to leave," she said quietly. "You stay where you are." "That's all right, Mrs. Heath," Bliss replied cheerfully. "I've something in my mind for this morning." "I'll be sorry to lose you, Mr. Bliss," she went on, "but—" Her voice trembled for a moment. He nodded. "I understand," he interrupted. "Very likely you'll be able to take me back again sometime." He stood quite still for a minute after she had left the room. Then he sat down and ate as much as he could of his breakfast. Afterwards he dragged out his little bag, packed it with his spare suit and a few other toilet articles he possessed, and walked downstairs with it in his hand. He passed Mrs. Heath on the landing. She stood on one side to let him pass. "You're not afraid I'm going to bilk you, then, Mrs. Heath?" he asked with a smile. "Not in the least, sir," she replied. How much do I owe you exactly?" 28 and sixpence, she told him, "and I don't care if I never see a penny of it. I don't want you to go neither, Mr. Bliss, but if I lose the mappings, I'll never be able to pay my rent. They're hard times, sir," she wound up with a little sob. Bliss patted her hand and walked out without speech. He made his way to the nearest pawnbroker's and sold everything he possessed, except the clothes he stood up in, for 30 shillings. Then he returned to his lodgings. 18 pence change, please, Mrs. Heath, he said, handing her the money. "And look here, don't you worry if times are a little hard. I've a sort of idea that the new year may bring you luck." She smiled wanly as she counted out the 18 pence. "I've given up expecting that, sir," she replied drearily. "The best I have to hope for is that I shall be able to hang on for a few years longer, until I can get the children started in something or other, and then I think I shall be just too tired to bother much more about myself or anyone. I'm sorry you're going, Mr. Bliss. I can't tell you how sorry." "May come back again," Bliss promised, "if you've room for me. Very likely I'll be able to afford one of your downstairs rooms some day." "What have you done with your things?" she asked, still fingering the money doubtfully. "Left them in the cloakroom," he lied quickly. "I'm after a job this morning, and hadn't time to look for a room before I go. Good-bye." He shook hands with her, went out, and walked down the street smiling. He recognized within himself traces of a new disposition. He no longer found his thoughts fixed upon the selfish joys of his coming release. One of the greatest pleasures he could see before him was the emancipation of Mrs. Heath from her financial troubles. He walked down the street with that thought in his head, and he quite forgot that his feet were weary and his head ached. Then he bethought himself of his destination. He found himself face to face with the bald truth. He had 1 and 6pence in his pocket, a few coppers, and no place to sleep in. He made his way to Covent Garden, but his luck was out. In every odd job that was going, he was forestalled. Then he tried the Labour Bureau, and spent an hour and a half in a fruitless walk to Bermondsey and back. When night came, although he had eaten insufficiently, he had less than a shilling left, and he was dog-tired. He clenched his teeth and presented himself at a public lodging-house, paid his 6pence, took a ticket, and threw himself down upon one of the beds in its long bare room, a mere glance at which made him shudder, threw himself down, hoping to sleep. For an hour or two he succeeded, then he woke up and looked about him. The atmosphere of the place was unbearable. With trembling fingers he dressed and hurried out. The janitor looked at him curiously. "Off already?" he asked. Bliss nodded silently and passed out. The first breath of the night air seemed to him the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. Then the languor of insufficient sleep crept over his jaded senses. He made his way unconsciously down towards the Embankment, and seated himself on the first vacant seat. He turned his coat-collar up, and clasped his knees with his hands, turning round with his back to the wind. He slept for a few minutes, and then woke up, numbed with the cold. A young fellow about his own age was seated at the other end of the bench. He was adequately dressed, and had an air of prosperity which somehow or other Bliss found himself resenting. "Cold night for sleeping out," the newcomer remarked pleasantly. "Beastly," Bliss agreed. The young man drew nearer to him. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I'm not going to offer you charity. I suppose you're out of work. What is your trade?" Bliss hesitated for a moment. "Chauffeur," he replied. "Why are you out of a place?" the man asked. "Have you a character? Have you been in trouble?" "I have never been in trouble," Bliss told him, "if by that you mean in prison. I had to take work unexpectedly, that's all. I got a job at the Sun Motor Company, but they went into liquidation. Since then I've only picked up odd jobs." "You're the kind of man I've been looking for," the other declared confidently. "You've had a little experience of the difficulty of getting work over here. What about a fresh start in another country, eh?" "Another country?" "Look here. I can see, of course, that you're an educated man. You've come down in the world. I don't care how. That isn't our job. My name's Miles. I belong to a society, the Canadian Employment Bureau, we call it. Don't look upon it as a charitable affair, please. But there it is. We've got funds, and we're on the lookout all the time for deserving cases. We give them a small outfit, send them over to Canada, passage paid. Our agent meets them there, keeps a register of the vacant places, and finds them jobs. Now, what do you say to it?" "I say," Bliss replied, "that I should like to know more about the society." The young man handed him a pamphlet. Bliss thrust it into his pocket. "Look here," he said, sitting up. "This is no good for me, but it sounds like a thundering good thing all the same. I've got to stay in England, and the luck will change with me pretty soon, I know that. But I will remember this. I'll drop in and see you sometime, if I may. I suppose I might find the address of the office here." The other assented. "You're a queer chap," he observed curiously. "Why are you so certain that the luck is going to turn?" "I'm quite sure of it." "You're not masquerading, are you? Journalism or anything of that sort?" Bliss shook his head. "I'm hard up against it all right," he admitted, "but only for a time. I could anticipate the end of my troubles, but I won't. There. Now, I see it's getting light. I'm off for a walk." The young man coughed. "Nothing to do with the society," he began, "but if a trifling loan—" "You can stand me a cup of coffee if you like," Bliss interrupted. "With pleasure," the other agreed. "I'll have one myself." They stood at a stall in the street and drank 2 cups of the steaming liquid. Then Bliss shook hands with his new friend. "I'm glad to have met you," he said warmly. "Thanks for the coffee. I'll look you up some day." Bliss walked away with a briskness that was half assumed. Mechanically he made his way again to the Labour Bureau, and as he stood there a youth thrust a fresh announcement onto the board. Bliss looked at it, and his heart gave a little jump. 7 omnibus drivers wanted that morning, applications to be made at the general offices. One man who had been standing behind him swung round and started off at a run. Bliss drew a long breath and followed him. There were 5 men before him when he reached the office, breathless. The foreman looked him over, glanced at his references, and hesitated. "Ever driven a bus?" he asked tersely. "Never," Bliss admitted with a sinking heart. "I've driven all sorts of cars, though. I can manage it all right." The foreman wrote out a slip. "That's for your test drive," he explained. "You'll find practice omnibus number 4 in the yard behind. Go to Golders Green and back, and bring me the report." Bliss obeyed. He found the bus and an amiable-looking instructor. His fingers trembled as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Don't be nervous, young chap," the man by his side said. "She's easier to handle than she seems. Keep her steady, that's all." Bliss glanced at him gratefully. The streets were still half empty, and he drove to Golders Green and back without mishap. The instructor signed his ticket, and Bliss took it back to the foreman. At 9 o'clock his licence was checked, and he took out an omnibus. His route was from Golders Green to Waterloo, a distance which he accomplished 6 times during the day without incident. When he climbed down after his last journey, he felt almost exhilarated, although his eyes were heavy and his fingers numb. He made his way to the foreman. "I forgot to ask what my wages were," he said. The man laughed. "All the same," he replied. 36 bob. You'll see the fines posted up." "You couldn't advance me a few shillings out of my first week's salary, could you?" The foreman looked him up and down thoughtfully. Finally he thrust his hand into his pocket. "Here's 5 shillings for you, young fellow," he said. "I'll have to lend you that myself. Against the company rules to advance anything." "I shan't forget it," Bliss promised gratefully. Bliss found a small room at the top of a block of buildings off Oxford Street, and that night he slept so well that he had to run all the way to the yard to be on time to answer the roll next morning. Again he took out the bus and gazed down the London streets with new eyes. Towards the middle of the day rain fell, and the asphalt roadway became slippery. Once or twice he felt the great vehicle glide away from under his control. At the end of the day the strain had told upon him. The conductor looked at him curiously as they signed off. "You look white, Ernie, my boy," he remarked. "Nothing to be scared about. You've driven her proper all day." "I've been in a regular funk about skidding," Bliss confessed. "They all are at first," the conductor replied. "I'm going to stand you one." They had a drink together, and Bliss left for home, somehow a little cheered by the other's sympathy. The next day, as he brought his omnibus to a standstill at the corner of the Strand and Waterloo Bridge Road, he saw a familiar figure staring up at him from the pavement, open-mouthed and wondering. It was Mr. Crawley. Bliss kept an immovable countenance, and Mr. Crawley, recovering from his stupefaction, made a plunge for the bus. At the next stopping-place Bliss heard his pained voice on the pavement beside him. "My dear Mr. Bliss," he gasped. "My dear young sir, I'm most shocked. For heaven's sake, be reasonable." Bliss leaned towards him. "Hello, Crawley," he exclaimed. "How are things?" Mr. Crawley was bereft of words. He stretched across from the curbstone and laid his hand upon the other's shoulder. "Yesterday," he announced in a hoarse whisper, "I invested £38,000 for you." "I hope you remembered what I told you," Bliss observed, "and kept clear of English rails. South America and the Argentine are the countries I fancy right now." "I have remembered your instructions, sir," Mr. Crawley assured him. "I only mention the matter of investment at all because the situation is so absolutely absurd. I insist." "Look here," Bliss interrupted. "That's the bell, and I'm off. If you say a word to me except when we're standing still, why, you'll have to leave my bus, that's all. Now, jump on behind if you want to, and I'll talk to you at the next stop." They drove on for about a quarter of an hour. Then, as Bliss drew in to the side of the street, at one of his regular halting-places, Mr. Crawley appeared once more by his side. "I'm giving up," he said, "an important appointment in the city in order to reason with you. I insist upon an explanation. Where your bus goes, I go." "Is that poetry?" Bliss murmured. "It sounds familiar." Mr. Crawley reached over with his umbrella and tapped his client vigorously upon the shoulder. "Young man," he exclaimed, "you are a millionaire. Look at you. There is, pardon my referring to it, a hole in your trousers." "Where?" Bliss asked anxiously. "Your hands are unmentionable," Mr. Crawley continued, "and your collar, your tie, for heaven's sake," he burst out. "What's it all mean? You used to be one of the most carefully turned out young men in London. Finicky, we used to think you sometimes. And there you sit, on a bit of sacking, in positive rags, with your hands all over grease, a smut on your nose, an omnibus driver, and looking the part. What the devil?" In a matter of 49 days, Bliss interrupted. "I shall resume my position as a sane member of society. Between ourselves," he went on quietly, "I don't think I shall ever be quite the same Ernest Bliss whom you used to know. But apart from that, I promise you shall have nothing to complain of. Until then, the less I see of you, the better." Mr. Crawley bustled back to the rear. They were off again, and Bliss was sitting forward with his eyes glued upon the road and his hands firmly upon the wheel. It was 10 minutes before a further opportunity for conversation arose. "Is there nothing whatever I can do?" Mr. Crawley asked, as he came round once more to the front of the bus. "There is," Bliss replied. "I'm glad you haven't gone. Memory as good as ever?" "I think so," Mr. Crawley rejoined. "Go to 27 Overton Square, then. Inquire about a young lady, Miss Frances Clayton. See whether she is in employment or not. Let me have all the particulars tomorrow. You'll find me doing this same stretch." "I'll see to it with great pleasure," Mr. Crawley promised, scribbling down the address. "Any commission that has a gleam of common sense about it." "Got anything to smoke with you?" Bliss interrupted suddenly. Mr. Crawley produced a morocco leather case. One side was filled with cigars, the other with cigarettes. Bliss's eyes lit up as he transferred the whole of its contents to his pockets and returned the case empty. "You can get some more, you know," he said apologetically. "You'd better hop it now. We've got a clear run before us to Golders Green, and you don't want to go there." Mr. Crawley hailed a passing taxicab. Bliss and the conductor started on the cigarettes. "Rum old toff that was talking to you," the latter remarked. "My eye, what smokes!" "Used to be my lawyer before I blued it in," Bliss confided. "Queer old bird, but he means well." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Curious Quest by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. On the next morning, almost at the same hour and place, Bliss picked up Mr. Crawley. The latter reached his seat in a somewhat ruffled state. He came around to see his eccentric client at the first stop. "I do not approve of motor buses, Bliss," he pronounced, as he gazed down at the crease in his trousers. "Most democratic institutions. And your conductor who pulled me on to the step was, to say the least of it, familiar. I gather that you divided the contents of my cigar case with him." "Jolly good chap," Bliss replied. "Well, what about it?" Mr. Crawley coughed. "The young lady," he announced, "is still without a permanent situation, and I gather that she is owing her landlady money." Bliss frowned a little. "I've got to think that over," he said shortly. "Skip round behind now, please. We're off." At the next halt, Mr. Crawley once more made his appearance. "Have you any instructions to give?" he inquired, tapping his pocket-book with his pencil. Bliss nodded. "You can send 1,000 guineas to Mr. J. Miles, Canadian Employment Bureau, 17 Queen Victoria Street," he directed. "Anonymous donation." "Anything else?" £100 to William Jennings, 17 Printer Street, Camberwell. That's my mate on the bus. He has a child ill and wants to send her away. Anonymous, mind." "Certainly," Mr. Crawley assented. "Anything else?" 50 to Thomas Bride, foreman, head office of the Omnibus Company. "Then you better look up that chap who makes heels down in Finsbury," Bliss proceeded, "and see how he's getting on. If he wants any more capital, let him have it. And now listen to what I have to say. Invest £5,000 in the name of Mrs. Heath and pay her the first quarter's dividend in advance. Write and say that the sum has been placed in your hands absolutely for her benefit. You know the address." "You seem to have made a few friends," Mr. Crawley remarked. "What about the young lady?" Bliss's face darkened for a moment. He shook his head regretfully. "I can't do anything for her," he said simply. "She's got to hang on for 48 days. Mr. Crawley put his book in his pocket. "I'll take a ride with you another morning soon," he promised. "But you might explain to your friend William that a shove up behind, as he calls it, is not exactly a dignified way of assisting a person of my age and figure. What about some cigarettes?" Bliss shook his head. "Only ordinary perquisites are in order," he explained. "A handful of cigarettes from a passenger is all right. Twice following wouldn't do." "A small tip, I suppose," Mr. Crawley ventured. Bliss was thoughtful for a moment, then his face lightened. "You might," he suggested, "give sixpence to William. Be careful, though," he added anxiously, "to explain that it is for him to treat the driver as well as himself." "I will do so with pleasure," Mr. Crawley agreed. "Don't forget to mention the driver," Bliss called out after him as he turned away. The conductor made his way to the front at the next stopping-place. "The old buffer's stood us a tanner, Ernie," he exclaimed with glee. "We'll wet it when we get to the end." Bliss smiled. "He does chuck his money about, don't he?" he remarked. On Saturday, Bliss received 27 shillings and 2 hours off. He repaid his loan of 5 shillings to the foreman and made his way at once to Frances' lodgings. She met him at the door, already dressed for the street. Her manner was listless, and even her smile seemed forced as she gave him her hand. "At last," she murmured. "If I hadn't seen you today—" "No threats, please," he interrupted. "I'll tell you the sober truth. I didn't come before because I dared not." "Then you are not working?" she exclaimed. "You must have been wanting the money you lent me all the time." "Nothing of the sort," he answered promptly. "I wasn't exactly working, but I was always earning a bit. Now," he added proudly, "I've got a regular job." "What is it?" she asked, with a tired smile. "I'm driving a bus," Bliss explained. "Queer sort of a job in a way, but it's 36 bob a week." "A bus," she repeated. "I've just been paid, and I'm starving," Bliss remarked as he took her arm. "Come along." "I'm not going to have dinner with you," she declared. "But you are," he insisted. She shook herself free from him. "It's no good, Ernest," she said. "I've lost my last place. My landlady has given me notice. I'm finished. I'm going to write to Mr. Masters tonight. If he wants me to go back, I'm going." "Frances," he cried anxiously. "I can't help it," she went on. "I've struggled along, but it's the same every time I take a situation. And there are my sisters to think of. I'm doing nothing for them, and there's so much that ought to be done." "But you don't care about this chap Masters," Bliss protested. "Of course I don't," she replied. "You know quite well that you are the only person I care about in that way, or ever could. But it isn't any use. A bus driver at 36 shillings a week can't afford to keep a wife and be saddled with the care of 2 of her sisters. You know that as well as I do. That's why I don't want to see you any more. That's why I don't want to have dinner with you tonight." Bliss was silent for a moment. She glanced at his face, and her eyes filled with tears. "I'll change my mind," she declared suddenly. "I will come and have dinner with you. We'll have our little table, and even a bottle of Medoc, if you like, and perhaps those men will play. I'm so dull and tired. And then, Ernest, we must say good-bye." "We'll see about that," he muttered. Anyway, dinner first. They made their way to the little restaurant, and as usual she pored over the bill of fare with him and struck out the most expensive items. Somehow she had never before seemed so desirable to him. Thin though she was, she had never lost that curious grace of movement, a sort of natural elasticity of frame and carriage, which made her easily distinguishable, notwithstanding her worn clothes and thick boots. Her cheeks were paler, but her eyes seemed nearer the shade of violets, and the brown in her hair was softer. A certain severity with which she had sometimes kept him at arm's length deserted her that evening. She leaned back in her chair and abandoned herself to the relaxation of the moment. She was unusually provocative. She let her hand lie in his. He felt the thrill of her presence as he had never felt it before, and when one of the musicians, fingering his instrument, played softly to his companion at a distant table, she listened with half-closed eyes. Her head and all her body seemed to sway gently with the music. They sat in the place for nearly 2 hours. Then Bliss suddenly glanced at the clock. "Walk down with me to the yard," he begged. "I have to take out my bus in a quarter of an hour." She sat for a moment quite still. Then she burst into a peal of laughter. "Take your bus out?" she repeated. "Oh, you strange, strange boy. Yes, I'll come." Bliss paid his bill. When they got outside he took her arm. She made no effort to withdraw it. On the contrary, she drew closer to him. "Dear," he said, "there are some things I cannot explain to you. You think I am a fool, over-sanguine, an idiot, because where you see a cul-de-sac, I see before us freedom and happiness. I want you to trust me." She sighed. "You've spoken like this before, dear. If you have hopes of which you have told me nothing, then you ought to share them with me. I don't like mystery. This is the end of it, Ernest. I do love you, but there's no hope for us, and I can't go through what I've been going through any longer. I wore spectacles at my last place and did my hair. Oh, what a mess I made of it!" She laughed. "My employer coolly asked me if the spectacles were necessary, and then instructed me to remove them. That was the day he asked me to go out to lunch for the 3rd time." "Have one more try," Bliss begged. "Surely you can find a place where you would not be subjected to this sort of thing." "Find it for me," she challenged. "I've tried everywhere. A woman who earns her own living puts her pride in her pocket. She is supposed not to understand and what men mean when they make the stereotyped advances. I've tried. I can't stand it, that's all. I'll hate it all my life, but I'd sooner go through a little ceremony with Mr. Masters and call myself his wife and provide for my sisters, and then rest. That's what I want to do more than anything in the world." "You shall have plenty of rest," Bliss promised confidently, "but not with Mr. Masters. Listen, these aren't idle words of mine. Trust me, and I swear that before 6 weeks have passed I shall be in a position to marry you and help your sisters." "Show me one atom of proof," she implored him. "I can't," he confessed. "Trust me." She shook her head. "It's always the same, Ernest. If you had friends or a future, would you have drifted almost to starvation all these weeks, and then jumped at the chance of driving a bus?" "I can't explain," he said doggedly. "Then I can't wait," she retorted. "Why should I?" "Because I love you," he answered simply. "Because there is no future for you except to be my wife. Don't you understand that we belong to each other? You wouldn't dare to do what you suggest. It wouldn't be honest to Mr. Masters." "I'm tired of thinking about other people," she declared. They were walking more slowly now. They were within a few yards of the great omnibus yard. Bliss glanced at the clock. "Dear," he pleaded, "trust me a little longer. The time is so short now. Don't ruin both our lives." She made a little grimace. There were 2 big tears in her eyes. "I knew how it would be," she sighed, "if I went out with you at all." "You promise?" he persisted. "I promise," she answered. "I'll have another try." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31. It was nearly 6 weeks later when Bliss, who had been promoted to the Piccadilly route, was suddenly hailed from the pavement. A tall, exceedingly well-dressed young man had dropped his monocle and was flourishing his cane. "Hi!" he exclaimed. "Hi there!" Bliss brought the bus to a standstill. Honiton regarded him from the pavement in blank amazement. "Hello, Bliss!" he shouted. "We go to Hammersmith and Barnes," Bliss said politely. "Did I understand you to hail the bus?" "Well, I'm dashed!" was Honiton's first coherent exclamation. "Come for a ride with me," Bliss begged. "It won't cost you more than 4pence all the way, and you'll get lots of excitement for your money. How are things?" "A motor bus driver!" Honiton gasped. "A healthy, not to say a sporting occupation," Bliss assured him. "Jump up behind if you're coming along. Can't keep my bus standing here all day." They were badly blocked at Hyde Park Corner, and Honiton suddenly appeared on the footboard. By this time he had collected himself. "Ernest, old chap," he said, "I've been looking for you everywhere." "Is that so?" Honiton coughed. He seemed a little ill at ease. "When can I see you for a few minutes under more reasonable circumstances?" he asked, glancing with horror at an oil stain upon his glove. "Well, I haven't much time after work," Bliss explained doubtfully. "I have to meet my girl directly I leave off." "Your what?" Honiton gasped, with a visible effort at self-control. "My girl," Bliss repeated. "Didn't I tell you I was engaged?" "I don't think you mentioned it," Honiton mumbled. "Anyway, I am," Bliss continued. "She has a temporary job as a typist, only a couple of streets off our yard. This is my last journey tonight. I get 4 hours off, so she'll be round to meet me. Could you come on to the next stopping place if you're not very busy?" "Righto," Honiton agreed. "I'll come on a little further. See you again later." The bus started again and duly reached its destination. Bliss crossed his legs and, turning round in his seat, found Honiton waiting on the pavement. "Now then," he invited. Honiton rested one immaculately gloved hand upon a dry spot on the front of the bus, and the other upon the rail, and, after a nervous glance around to be sure that they were alone, he leaned over from the curbstone in a confidential manner. "Look here, Bliss, old chap," he began. "When I left you in the Strand the other day, I had the hump for a while. One hates to think of a pal coming a real cropper, and not seeming to have the gift, for pulling himself together. You understand what I mean," he went on hastily. "Take my case now. I've been absolutely stony broke. But do I look it? Could anyone ever guess it? That's because I've the knack of pulling myself together and making the best of things, see?" Bliss nodded. "Oh, yes, I see," he assented. "Well," Honiton continued, "I thought it all over, and finally I discussed it with a few of our old pals. Now, don't get skittish," he exclaimed quickly, as Bliss started. "Listen to what I've got to say. I made a little proposition to them," he proceeded, drawing a sheet of paper from his pocket, "and they were all over it, Bliss, I assure you. We never asked a single soul to subscribe. The oof simply rolled in. There's Freddie Lancaster, never seemed to have a lot, and we used to chaff him about being stingy. He weighed in with a pony before we could tell him the whole of the story, and I tell you, we had a hardest job to keep the girls out of it. There was little Nellie Powers and Flo Graves, and half-a-dozen more of them wanted to give half their salary for months. Freddie and I, though, put our foot down at that. We knew how you'd feel, and we wouldn't take a penny from a girl." "What's it all about, anyway?" Bliss asked, his voice shaking a little. "Simply this, old chap," Honiton concluded. "Some of your old pals have put their heads together, and they have decided to give you a dinner on your own date, and at the close of the dinner they're going to hand you a little cheque, which, believe me, will be worth having, for you to go to Canada or America or wherever you choose, and make a fresh start, or make it here amongst us, if you like. Anyway, as Freddie Lancaster said, it's just a little rebate upon all the hospitality and kindness you've shown to lots of these fellows when they've been in a hole, and just to, let you see that they don't want a pal to slip down without stretching out a helping hand, and that sort of thing." Honiton wound up with a sigh of relief. Bliss turned his head away. He was looking down the long vista of the crowded street. Suddenly the vehicles seemed all tangled together, the faces of the people blurred and indistinct. There was a lump in his throat. He could scarcely trust himself to answer. Honiton was tremendously busy with his cigarette case, and had moved a little further back to get a light. "Well, old chap?" he asked presently. "I can't say much to you," Bliss declared. "This has taken my breath away. Will you just say that I'll dine with them all with pleasure, and if it isn't too soon, I should like the date to be December 19th. "That's fine!" Honiton exclaimed. "We'll say 8 o'clock, and it will be at the Milan. We shall get the Venetian room. If you don't mind, old chap, I'll hop it now," he went on. "I dare say you're used to it, but this bus shakes me up a bit. There's a taxi stand there, and I'll just be getting back. So long. Don't forget, Venetian room at the Milan, 8 o'clock, December 19th. And, by the by," he added, "about the young lady." "There's my girl, of course," Bliss said. "May I bring her with me?" "Of course you may," Honiton replied. "You bring her along, and we'll give you both a good send-off. So long once more." "So long," Bliss echoed, a little dazed. Bliss was unusually silent that night as Francis and he made their way towards the little restaurant. "Nothing wrong, is there?" she inquired, with some anxiety. "You haven't lost your place?" "Not I," he assured her promptly. "I haven't even touched a fine yet. Only I had rather a shock today. Some of the men I used to know when I was better off want to give us a dinner, and a start-off somewhere, Francis. They've subscribed quite a decent sum. What do you think about it?" "Do you mean to go abroad?" He nodded. "That seems to be the idea." She was thoughtful for a moment. Her eyes were soft, and he knew very well what was in her mind. "It's your sisters you're thinking about, isn't it?" he asked, as they took their places in the restaurant. "Supposing there was enough to let Ruth have some singing lessons, and to send Elsie down to a quiet place in the south somewhere." She held his hand under the table. "I'll just do whatever you think best, dear," she said. "Only you mustn't try to do too much for them." "Those fellows want us to dine with them on December 19th, Bliss announced. She made a little grimace. "Ernest," she expostulated, "how could I? You know my wardrobe pretty well, and the 19th is next Thursday." He sat quite still in his place. His eyes seemed to be looking through the walls. "Next Thursday," he repeated wonderingly. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Curious Quest by Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Bliss awoke on the morning of the 19th of December with a curious little throb of expectation. He lay with wide-open eyes, looking around him. Now that the time had really come, he could scarcely believe that his year was over, his privations actually at an end. His thoughts dwelt only a moment or two upon the change that day would bring him personally. The wonderful part of it all was Frances. More wonderful than anything was the fact that, at the end of these 12 long months of hardship and suffering, it was of someone else he thought, and not of himself. He sprang out of bed and washed and dressed as carefully as possible. Then he counted his money. He had 32 shillings, and he owed 7 for his room. He paid his bill, and at a little after 8 o'clock sallied out into the street. As he opened the front door, he almost ran into a familiar little figure whose hand was upon the bell. "Mrs. Heath!" he exclaimed. "Why, good morning!" It was a transfigured Mrs. Heath, a tremulous, beatific Mrs. Heath, with a touch of heaven in her face and all the joy of the world shining out of her poor, tired eyes. She clutched at Bliss's hand. "It's you, sir, it's you that's done it," she cried, holding his hands tightly, devouring him with her eager gaze. "I've thought it out all ways. It came anonymous last night with bank notes for £65, and not a wink of sleep have I had all night. And I've changed some of them, and they're real. And oh, sir, oh, Mr. Bliss! The children are safe, and I can send Hughie to school, and I know it's you, and I can't say a word. My throat's full. May God bless you." The wonder of it all seized Bliss. He saw a new world, a new horizon. The tired little woman from Fendon Street had lifted the curtain. He felt strange tears in his own eyes as he thrust his arm protectingly through hers. "Dear Mrs. Heath," he said, "you were so kind to me, and you taught me so much. I sent you the money. I want you to be happy and free from anxiety all your life. You've done your share of work, you know, and in a few days I shall bring my wife to see you." "You've plenty left for yourself, sir?" Mrs. Heath asked, with a very human nervousness. Bliss laughed gaily. "I have more money, Mrs. Heath, than any man ought to have," he assured her. "I've wasted a good deal of it, and a good deal of myself. We'll come and tell you the story in a few days. I'm going back to my own." "If there's a heaven, sir," she began. Bliss wrung her hand as he hurried off, but at the corner of the street he turned to watch her for a moment. She was stepping briskly along homeward. Her head was a little uplifted. With a sudden clearness of vision, he fancied that he could read her thoughts, that he could realize the crushing weight lifted from her poor, overtired heart. The sweetness of it all, the children safe and cared for, the warm, luxurious peace of her finished struggle for existence. The little black figure vanished almost jauntily in the crowd, and Bliss turned on his way with a laugh that was almost a sob. Arrived at the offices of the omnibus company, he made his way at once to the foreman's office. "Brought you back my cheque, sir," he announced. "I couldn't find you last night, and I was driving till past 1 o'clock. "Going to leave us, Bliss?" the man asked. "I thought you were getting on so well." "I've come into a little piece of good fortune, sir," Bliss explained. "I'm going to give up driving for the present." The man stared at him. "Well, I'm hanged if yours ain't a lucky bus," he declared. "Your mate Jennings is going round the place as if he was stark mad. Some bloke he never heard of has sent him £100 for his kids. Queer part of it is that I tumbled into 50 quid myself a few days ago. And now you're in luck. Fair licks me, blowed if it don't." He glanced a little suspiciously at Bliss, who made his escape as soon as he could. He breakfasted at the coffee stall and set off for Frances' lodgings. She was just leaving the house as he arrived. Her face fell. "You haven't lost your place, Ernest?" she exclaimed anxiously. He shook his head. "I'm taking a holiday," he said, "and I want you to take one too." "Holiday indeed," she echoed bitterly. "You know I can't do anything of the sort." "On the contrary, I know that you can, and you will," he replied. "If I ask nothing more of you in this world, dear, I'm going to ask you to do as I tell you today. Please telephone to your people and tell them that you are unable to come to work. You might add that it will be exceedingly doubtful if you ever return at all." She looked at him, and her hands began to tremble. For a moment she did not speak, and he found himself studying her for the last time in this guise, with a rapt and curious interest. He saw the shiny places on her worn black jacket, and the neat lace collar at her throat, grown threadbare with frequent washings. He realized all the pathos of that desperate struggle between her womanly instinct for neatness and the hard hand of poverty. The faded band of ribbon carefully arranged around her hat, the mended gloves, the shoes, both of them now with their little patch. He guessed at the quality of her miserable breakfast. There was something in her footsteps akin to the tired plod of the countless multitudes thronging their way citywards. Nothing that he himself had suffered seemed worth an instant's thought compared with the joy of his present anticipations. "Ernest," she gasped, "has anything really happened?" He took her arm tightly and hailed a taxicab. "Nothing has happened, dear, that is not good," he assured her. "Nothing is going to happen that is not good for both of us. Now, will you just sit in this cab while I go across to the telephone box and telephone to your people?" She obeyed him, but when he came back he could see that she was still distressed. He took her hand and held it firmly. "Dear," he said, "you must start the day by being a little brave. You have a lot to go through before it is over, but I want you to try to think of one thing, and trust in me. Your troubles are over. Not only your troubles, but the troubles of your two sisters are over. My troubles are over. We have had a hard struggle, but today it has come to an end." "Don't tell me too much," she begged. "I'm afraid I cannot bear it. But tell me a little." "We shall neither of us ever know again what it means to be absolutely poor," he said. "Do you mean that you have a rise? A better situation?" He smiled cheerfully. Something even better than that," he assured her. "Everything will be made absolutely clear to you, quite naturally, if you will only trust me and remember that I love you as I love nothing else on earth. Just sit still and take things as they come, and believe that what is coming is good." She pressed his hands with sudden fervour. All that she would have said was in her eyes. Suddenly the taxicab stopped. "Where on earth are we?" she asked. He handed her out onto the pavement and paid the taxicab man. "It's a church," she gasped, looking at him in amazement. He led her across the threshold. The church was in a busy neighbourhood, and no one took any notice of them as they passed in. Bliss removed his hat and stood still for a moment. "Dearest," he said softly, "is this a great shock to you? Try and bear it. We are going to be married." She laughed, a little hysterically, and then, before she could say anything, she was suddenly conscious that he was leading her up the aisle, and that the organ was playing soft music. There was scarcely anyone else in the building. The words of the service commenced almost as soon as they reached the chancel. A pew-opener gave her away. Her responses were almost mechanical. The clergyman summoned them afterwards into the vestry, where they signed their names. Bliss laid a piece of paper upon the table and whispered in the clergyman's ear, "Don't look at that until after we've gone. It's a little thank-you offering. You can make what use of it you like." The clergyman shook hands with them. They walked down the aisle and once more out into the street. She caught at his arm. "Ernest," she faltered, "do you realize what we've done?" "Of course I do," he answered cheerfully. "I've been preparing for it for a long time. Bless you, the banns have been up for nearly a month." "And you never told me?" "I never told you," he replied, "for a reason which you will now understand in a very short time. All I can say is, please still trust in me." "Another taxicab!" she exclaimed, as he held up his hand. "Ernest," she added with a frown, "I'm afraid I shall have to begin lecturing you very early. Even if you have a good place, you can't afford taxicabs all the time." He laughed as he gave the man the address. Then he sat by her side and held her tightly to him. "Dearest," he whispered fervently, "this is the most wonderful moment of my life. You belong to me for always. You are my wife. Do you realize it? My wife!" He kissed her, heedless of the passers-by. She looked at him wonderingly. His lips were quivering, as though with anticipation. His eyes were bright. They drew up at last in Harley Street. He helped her to alight, paid the man, and rang the bell of the most familiar front door, which was opened almost immediately by the same pompous servant. "Is Sir James Aldroyd in?" "What name, sir?" "Just tell him a patient," Bliss replied. "I have come to see him professionally." "Have you an appointment, sir?" the man asked. "I have," Bliss told him grimly. "I made it 12 months ago." The servant stared at him for a moment in a puzzled manner. Then he showed them both into a waiting-room and left them. Frances caught his arm. "But, Ernest," she exclaimed, "you are not ill? Don't tell me that you are ill." "Never better in my life," he assured her cheerfully. "Just wait, that's all, and remember what I told you. Everything is going to turn out wonderfully for us. Think of all the things you want in life, and imagine that they are coming true. Then the shock won't be so great." The servant reappeared. "Sir James will see you, sir," he announced. They were ushered into the same consulting room. Sir James looked up from his table, and it was obvious that he failed to recognize his visitor. It was obvious, too, that he was a little surprised by this visit from a young couple who scarcely seemed to belong to the class of patient whom he was accustomed to see in Harley Street. He turned around in his chair. "What can I do for you?" he asked. Bliss came and stood by the table. "You don't recognize me, Sir James?" The physician looked at him curiously. "I recollect you perfectly," he exclaimed with sudden interest. "Your name is Bliss." "Quite right," Bliss admitted. Sir James leaned back in his chair and scrutinized his visitor. There happened to be a mirror just behind, and Bliss caught a glimpse of his own face. With a lightning-like effort of memory, he saw himself as he had been on that memorable visit 12 months ago, dressed in ultra-fashionable clothes, languid, pallid, and heavy-eyed from the effects of late hours and ill digestion. A young man about town, seeking for his pleasures in the flowery waves of dissipation, without a single aim in life or a serious thought. In the looking-glass opposite he saw now a very different young man, unfashionably dressed, sturdier, grimmer, with new lines about his mouth and a steady light in his eyes. He drew a great sigh of relief. It seemed to him at that moment that he realized, with a strange and wonderful thankfulness, all that had happened to him. "Have you brought me," the physician asked, "that £25,000? "I have not," Bliss answered steadfastly, "because you have lost your bet. 12 months ago I left your rooms, and a few hours later I walked out into the street with a £5 note in my pocket and only the clothes I stood up in. From that day to this I've lived entirely and wholly on what I've earned. I've kept my word in the letter and in the spirit. I've accepted alms from no one. I've gained no benefit, direct or indirect, from my position or my means. In cases where, to alleviate the distress of others, I have drawn from my resources, I have cut myself away from those people at once, so that no advantage could possibly come to me. I have been a chauffeur, a light porter, a commercial traveller, and I wound up driving an omnibus for nearly 2 months. I left the company this morning with a good character." The physician leaned back in his chair and looked at his patient thoughtfully. "And your health?" he inquired. "Excellent. The giddiness and faintness you complained of gone." Sir James rose and held out his hand. "My young friend," he declared solemnly, "I have never had a patient of whom I am more proud. I shake your hand, not once, sir, but as many times as you like." Bliss was conscious of a curious thrill as he stood there, his hand grasped by the strong, capable fingers of the older man. He thought once more of that other day 12 months ago, when he had lounged in after a late night to receive the first blow which had struck beneath the veneer of his self-confidence and self-esteem. He remembered the rush of passionate shame which had given birth to his bet. He was conscious of the new vigour in his life. The tears stood in his eyes. "I have gained many things during my exile, Sir James," he said, "amongst others, a wife." Sir James turned and bowed to Francis. "My wife," Bliss continued, smiling at the wonder in her face and drawing her affectionately towards him, "was a typist. She did not even call herself a young lady typist. She has earned her own living for the last 6 years." "I congratulate you both heartily," Sir James said. "Your husband, my dear young lady," he added to Francis, "is a most wonderful person, for whom I have a sincere admiration. He has done what very few young men in his position and with his bringing up would have been capable of." Francis was incapable of speech. Bliss patted her hand. "We were only married this morning," he explained, "and she married me as a poor man. I am trying to prepare her for the change gradually. And in the meantime, if you will give me a dip of ink, Sir James, your hospital shall not suffer from the fact that I have won my wager." Bliss drew a brand-new cheque-book from his pocket. Once more he signed his name at the foot of a cheque. Once more the sense of wealth and power swept over him. "Pay to Sir James Oldroyd or order the sum of £25,000. He read the words upon the cheque over to himself and laughed softly. "Doctor," he said, "I had 12 7 when I came in, and my wife was reproaching me for extravagance because we have had 2 taxicabs this morning." The physician leaned over and saw the amount of the cheque. Once more he grasped Bliss's hand. "My young friend," he exclaimed, "if you could only realize the good this is going to do." "Sir James," Bliss replied, "I can realize better now than I could have done 12 months ago. Thanks to you, I have found a dozen ways in which I can occupy my time and my money in the future. There is nothing I am so anxious to hear, Sir James said, as the story of your adventures. Will you and your wife do me the honour of dining with me any night next week? Shall we say Wednesday? I should like to ask some of the directors of my hospital to meet you. That will give us great pleasure, Bliss assented. You will excuse us now. This has been our first visit. The physician touched the bell. He gave them each a hand. I wish you both all the happiness you deserve, he said heartily. I don't think, he added, patting Bliss upon the shoulder, that I have ever had a patient who has done me greater credit. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33, the last chapter of The Curious Quest by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. A very handsome motor car was drawn up outside the physician's door. The chauffeur touched his hat and smiled as Bliss and his wife emerged. A footman held open the door. "Glad to see you again, Hayes," Bliss said pleasantly. "Car going all right?" "Considering it's been slung up in the garage for 12 months, sir, it's going very well." "We'll soon get it in running order again," Bliss declared as he handed Francis in. "We shall be going down to the south of France for a few weeks." The door was closed, the man sprang to his place, and the car glided off. Francis was looking now almost terrified. "Don't tell me too much all at once," she implored, "but tell me, is this car yours?" "No, it's ours," Bliss replied. "Now listen to me, dear. It's time you knew the truth. 12 months ago I was feeling out of sorts. I was rich, lazy, and selfish. I was sitting up too late at night, eating too much, drinking too much, smoking too much, with nothing to occupy my thoughts or my mind but my own pleasure. My nerves gave out. I went to see that man whom we have just left. I wasn't the sort of patient he cared for. He told me just about as brutally as he could exactly what he thought of me and my manner of life, and he practically showed me the door. When I held out my hand to say good morning, he refused to shake hands. He wouldn't prescribe for me. The only advice he would give me was to go out and earn my own living for 12 months. He added that he believed me incapable of such an effort. I lost my temper. I bet him that for 12 months I would earn my own living without touching a penny of my own money except a £5 note. That 12 months is up today, and I have won my bet. The bet was £25,000 for his hospital against a shake of the hand and an apology, and you saw him, Francis. He paid like a man." "And you," she faltered, "all the time you were rich? You could have paid the £25,000? "I could have paid it many times over," Bliss admitted. "In fact, I have just given that sum to the hospital. I'm afraid you will think me a terrible fraud, but don't you see the position I was in? If ever I touched my own money, I had to be careful that no benefit came to me. I saw that nothing but capital would save Mr. Masters, so I got it and pushed his cooking stoves. But after that I had to leave him. I saved that heel manufacturer from bankruptcy, but directly I had advanced the money, I had to go. You were my most severe problem. I was dying to save you from distress and suffering. And on the other hand, I had one great ambition, and that was to win you as a poor man, to have you marry me knowing nothing, and then to try and make life as much like a fairy story as I could." She began to cry, softly. "Don't take any notice of me for a few minutes," she begged. Life has been so hard lately, and I was beginning to lose even hope." Presently they drew up at Alton Court. The porter received Bliss with a glance of astonishment at his attire, but with marked deference. They mounted to the 4th floor. Bliss touched the bell. A very subdued close opened the door. Mr. Crawley was waiting in the hall. "Here we are at last," he exclaimed, holding out his hand with an air of immense relief. "My dear Bliss, I'm delighted to see you. I've obeyed all your instructions to the letter, and have asked no questions. May I be introduced?" "This is Mr. Crawley, Francis," Bliss said. "My lawyer and very good friend. I've driven him nearly mad during the last 12 months, but I think that he will forgive me when he knows all about it." "A very remarkable young man, your husband, my dear Mrs. Bliss," Mr. Crawley declared as he shook hands. "I must confess that at times his exploits during the last year have caused me some anxiety. With one of them, however, I am now thoroughly disposed to sympathize." Francis, still a little shy, gave him her hand with a very sweet smile. They passed on into the dining-room, where the cloth was laid for lunch. Mr. Crawley rang the bell. "Mrs. Crawley," he said, "has engaged a maid for your wife, and the suite has been got ready as well as possible. This way." He escorted them to the door of a wonderful little boudoir, which opened into a bedroom. A neatly dressed maid came respectfully forward. The bedroom was a wonderful sight. Every article of furniture in it was piled with boxes. "I don't think I have forgotten anything," Mr. Crawley went on, glancing at his notebook. "Lavillians have sent up a dozen morning gowns and half a dozen evening ones, and their fitter and dressmaker will be here in an hour's time. The other things you wanted from Bond Street are all here on approval." "Will Madame breakfast first, or would she like her bath prepared?" the maid asked quietly. Francis looked at Bliss. Her lips quivered. He passed his arm through hers. "You can prepare Madame's bath in half an hour," he directed, "and make a selection of clothes for the morning. Come along, dear. I think it is time we drank one another's health in something better than the Medoc you used to grudge me so." "Open some champagne, Close," Bliss ordered, as they passed back into the dining-room. "Now, Mr. Crawley, if you like, here's my story." He told it in a few words. The lawyer listened silently to the end, and when it was finished he wrung his client's hand. "Mr. Bliss," he declared, "you have taken my breath away. All I can say is that I wish you both the happiness you deserve." "We'll drink to it," Bliss said, holding up his glass. "I drink both your healths, my dear young people," the lawyer continued. "Yours is a marriage which has begun in romance. You have both had your share of life's hardships. You have both something to remember all your days. And I," Mr. Crawley concluded, as he took up his hat, "shall never forget how well your husband, my dear Mrs. Bliss, looked on the box-seat of a motor omnibus." He took his leave a few minutes later. For the first time they were alone. Frances turned towards her husband. "I can't believe it," she faltered. "I shall never get used to it all." He laughed reassuringly. Then he drew her slowly towards him. She seemed to have become curiously passive. "Dearest," he said, "it's all quite true. You are rich, just as rich as you want to be. You can send your sisters abroad whenever you want to. You can give them a home." Ruth can go to Dresden for her singing lessons, and Elsie can be sent wherever you like on the Riviera. We might take her with us." She was crying quietly, but underneath it all Bliss could see the tremulous happiness in her face. "It's too wonderful," she whispered, clinging passionately to him. "The most wonderful thing of all," he whispered, "is our two selves. That you are my wife, Francis, and that I love you as I never believed I could love anyone." Her arms tightened around his neck. For the moment she forgot everything else. Then there came a discreet knock at the door. The maid entered. "Everything is ready for Madame," she announced. 22 exceedingly well-groomed young men were awaiting the arrival of Bliss and his wife that evening in the Venetian room at the Milan restaurant. Honiton, who was in charge of the proceedings, was a little nervous. "You don't suppose there's any chance of his not turning up?" Freddie Lancaster asked him. "Not the slightest," Honiton declared. "He'll be here all right, but, Freddie, I don't know whether you fellows all understand. I'm not sure that he even has a suit of evening clothes to his name. He was looking like nothing on earth when I saw him last." The young man whom he was addressing smoothed out his tie complacently. "Poor old Ernie," he sighed. "Hooked up to a girl, too. I say, you fellows, when do you think we ought to make the presentation?" "Soon as possible, of course. Don't keep him in anxiety too long. I should think he'd enjoy his dinner better if he knew that there was 1,000 of the best waiting for him." The door of the room was suddenly opened, and a servant announced Mr. and Mrs. Bliss. The general feeling when they appeared was one of surprise. Bliss was as well and carefully dressed as any of them. He was looking a little thinner and older, perhaps, but he carried himself in a more dignified and serious manner. Francis, too, was not what they expected. She was dressed in a simple but wonderfully made white evening gown, and around her neck hung a string of pearls which looked amazingly like real ones. After the first shock they all crowded round him, and Bliss found himself shaking hands with an amazing number of his quondam companions. The awkwardness which many of them had dreaded was dispelled almost from the first by Bliss himself. He chatted gaily with everyone, and referred to past events without the slightest doleful allusion to the catastrophe which was supposed to have overtaken him. Presently dinner was announced. They all sat at a round table, and Bliss laughingly refused to be parted from Francis. He told them all his secret, that he had only been married this morning. In the midst of the drinking of healths, which naturally followed the announcement, Honiton arose. "Ernest Bliss," he said, "and you fellows, just a word. I'm not much of a hand at speech-making, but this is a gathering of one or two of your old friends, Bliss, who are sorry to hear that the luck has gone, and who have put their heads together, remembering the good times you used to give us all, and want you to accept a little wedding present from us. That's all, old chap. We've only taken subscriptions from those who insisted upon giving, and I've got to ask you to accept this little cheque, and I hope, for the sake of Mrs. Ernest, you won't refuse." Honiton sat down with an air of immense self-satisfaction and some relief. Bliss rose to his feet and faced them all. The cheque was passed up and lay open before him. He was a little pale, but his voice was wonderfully firm. "Honiton," he began, "and you others, my dear friends, I stand before you a guilty man. It is true that I have been in the direst poverty for the last 12 months, that I have worked for my living in many strange ways, but nevertheless I have a confession to make to you. The position was entirely a voluntary one. I never lost a penny of my money. I am richer today than I ever was. Far richer," he added, touching Francis' shoulder. There was a little murmur of amazement, some ejaculations of wonder. "You must let me explain," Bliss went on. "The fact is, I found out that I had been living a thoroughly selfish, ill-regulated life, and I was badly run down. 12 months ago today, I went to Sir James Aldroyd and explained my symptoms to him. He treated me very brusquely. He wouldn't even trouble to prescribe for me. He told me as plainly as he could that he had no sympathy with young men who lost their health pleasure-seeking. He said a few things which stung me to the quick. When I turned to leave, he pretended not to see my hand. The only advice he would give me was to earn my living for 12 months, and he gave me pretty clearly to understand that he did not think me capable of the job. Well, I took him on. I laid him £25,000 for his hospital to the shake of a hand and an apology that I went off that morning with a £5 note and earned my living for 12 months entirely on my own. And I did. That's the secret of my disappearance. I was hard at it, earning enough to keep myself going. I did it somehow or other. The 12 months are up today. I've been to see Aldroyd, and he has paid up. Your money, my dear friends," Bliss went on, his voice shaking a little, "you must please take back. But your dinner and your greetings to my wife and myself are things which I shall never forget. I thank Heaven for the memory of this gathering, and that you fellows have thought it worth while to do this, and I trust that for many years in the future, on the anniversary of this night, you will all consider yourselves my guests." So the mystery of Bliss's disappearance was explained away at last. He resumed his seat amidst loud cheers and general stupefaction. Honiton himself was almost dazed. "Jolly plucky thing, I call it," he kept on repeating. "Little Ernie Bliss, too." They chaffed Honiton unmercifully. "You're a nice discoverer of poverty-stricken pals," one of them declared. "No one's lost anything by it, that I know of," Honiton retorted. "You'll get your money back. You've had a thundering good dinner, and I know now where my windfall came from. Once more before we part, long life and happiness to Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Bliss." They passed out of the hotel a short time later, down the carpeted stairs, into the very luxurious motor car which was waiting. They glided off into the Strand, and passed within a few yards of the spot where Francis had turned to go down to Mr. Montague's office. She leaned back amongst the cushions and looked out into the streets. Life was suddenly new and wonderful. The dull weight of care had fallen away. She remembered her many lectures on economy to Bliss, and she burst into a happy little laugh. "It's the same London, isn't it, Ernest?" she murmured. "The Drury Lane Café is somewhere up there, and you came along here on your omnibus a few hours ago." "It's the same London," he assured her, "only I hope that to both of us it will always be a different place. Those fellows tonight have taught me a lesson, Francis, those fellows and some of the people I've met during the last 12 months. I want to try and do something for the many thousands who are up against it as we were. Tomorrow I have all sorts of schemes. Tonight, he added, leaning towards her and taking her hand in his, belongs to our two selves. The end. End of chapter 33 and end of The Curious Quest by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Read by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, November 2021.